I built a massive logistics empire from a freezing Chicago garage. I survived corporate raiders, market crashes, and backstabbing partners. But the most lethal strike of my life did not come from a boardroom. It came while I was fighting for my last breath on a hospital stretcher. I am Richard. I am 70 years old. On a crisp Tuesday morning, I was sitting behind the massive desk in my corner office overlooking the Chicago skyline. I was reviewing the quarterly projections for the supply chain software company I founded 4 decades ago. Back then, I was just a hungry kid coding in a garage that smelled of motor oil. It started as a dull ache. I ignored it, chalking it up to the black coffee I had consumed since dawn. Then came the taste of copper in my mouth. Before I could reach for my water, an invisible vice clamped down on my chest. Time splintered into fragmented moments, the chaotic blur of faces, paramedics shouting my vitals, the sharp sting of a needle entering my arm, the violent jolt of the stretcher hitting the ambulance floor. Through it all, I remained conscious enough to understand the gravity of the situation. I could not have been more wrong. The emergency room at City General was a symphony of controlled chaos. Bright fluorescent lights stabbed at my eyes. Nurses moved around me with urgent precision, attaching electrodes to my chest, calling out numbers that clearly alarmed them. I lay there staring at the ceiling tiles, my breathing shallow and ragged. The doctor dialed the number on his mobile phone and put it on speaker so I could hear her voice, hoping it would bring me comfort. It rang 3 times before she answered. There was background noise, the sound of zippers closing luggage wheels rolling across hardwood floors. "Hello," Cynthia answered. Her tone was brisk, hurried. "Mrs. Cynthia," the doctor said, his voice calm and steady. "I am calling from City General Hospital. I am here with your husband Richard. He has suffered a severe heart attack. We are working to stabilize him now, but his condition is critical. We need you to come to the hospital immediately." I waited for the gasp. I waited for the panicked questions. I waited for the sound of my wife dropping everything. Instead, there was a long, heavy pause, then a sigh of pure, unadulterated annoyance. "Is this some kind of joke?" Cynthia said. Her voice was cold, sharp, and devoid of empathy. "Madam, please, I assure you, this is not a joke," the doctor replied, clearly taken aback. "Your husband is in critical condition. He needs his family." I heard the sound of a suitcase zipping shut on the other end of the line. "I cannot come to the hospital right now," she snapped. "Brandon and Tiffany have been packing for weeks. We are leaving for the airport in 2 hours. Our first-class flights to Maui are non-refundable." The doctor glanced down at me, his eyes wide with disbelief. I lay paralyzed, copper returning to my mouth. "Mrs. Cynthia, your husband might not survive the night," the doctor said. "You need to be here. Just give him a pill, doctor," Cynthia replied indifferently. "He is a tough old man. He can manage. I am not ruining my vacation over this. We have a private yacht booked for tomorrow. Tell Richard to call me when he is discharged. Have a good day." The line went dead. The silence in the trauma bay was deafening. The doctor slowly lowered his phone, staring at it, as if it had turned into a venomous snake. He looked at me, struggling to find words of comfort, but no words could fix what had just happened. As the darkness pulled me under, the grief and betrayal evaporated. In its place, a cold, calculating rage ignited in my chest. I swore a silent oath to myself in that fading moment. If I survive this single night, Cynthia will return from her tropical paradise to find nothing left. The sterile air of this intensive care unit was heavy with the scent of antiseptic and dying hope. I lay there, tubes snaking from my arms, my chest still throbbing with the ghost of that crushing weight. The door creaked open, and in walked Cynthia and Brandon. She leaned in, her perfume a sharp floral scent, clashing with the hospital's medicinal smell. "Richard, honey," she said, her voice dripping with artificial warmth. She placed a manicured hand on my arm, but her touch felt cold. "The doctor says the worst is over. You look so much better than you did last night." I did not answer. I just watched her. I wanted to see if there was any real fear in her eyes, any lingering trace of the woman who had shared my bed for 15 years. All I saw was impatience. She kept glancing at her watch, the gold links glinting under the harsh overhead lights. "Me staying here will just stress you out," Cynthia continued. her tone shifting to that familiar sugary sweet register she used when she wanted to manipulate me. I know you, Richard. You want everyone to be strong, to be productive. She patted my hand, then pulled it away quickly, as if she had touched something dirty. I nodded slowly, keeping my face slack. It was the easiest performance of my life. I played the role of the frail, dependent old man who was grateful for his family's presence. Inside, I was reading them like a profit and loss statement. They were not here to comfort me. I took a deep breath, feeling the mechanical whine of the ventilator nearby. Yes, I managed to whisper, my voice raspy and thin. You should go. I do not want to hold you back. A look of relief passed between them. It was subtle, almost invisible, but I saw it. See, I told you, Brandon said, flashing that crooked grin I once mistook for sincerity. Dad knows the value of hard work. He knows we cannot just pause the world because of one bad day. I looked at my stepson. For years I had treated Brandon as if he were my own blood. I had guided him, mentored him, and handed him the keys to the kingdom I had built with my bare hands. I had trusted him when I should have been watching his moves. Cynthia began to fuss with the collar of my hospital gown, a gesture that meant nothing. She was just keeping up appearances for the nurse passing by the door. You rest, she instructed, her voice regaining that authoritative edge. We have everything under control at the office. We will call you from the airport. I watched her turn to the mirror on the wall, checking her lipstick, adjusting a stray hair. She had no intention of staying a minute longer than necessary. The hospital was a place of sickness, and Cynthia hated anything that reminded her of reality. Brandon took a step toward me, the jovial expression shifted, becoming more professional, more transactional. He reached into his suit jacket and pulled out a thick stack of legal papers. The paper was thick, expensive, the kind that held weight. It felt heavy even from where I lay. Dad, just one quick thing before we head to the airport, he said. It is just the standard medical and financial power of attorney. We need it so we can sign the new vendor contracts and keep the payroll moving while you are stuck in this bed. They just need your signature to keep things running. I stared at the papers, my pulse raced, the machine beside me picking up the pace. This was it, the move, the play to take the keys while I was still bleeding out. They were not asking, they were finalizing. I looked at Brandon, then at the papers, and for a fleeting moment I almost laughed. I shifted in the bed, groaning as if the pain were too much to bear, my hands fumbling weakly as I reached for the pen. I was the clueless old man they wanted, and I would play that part until the very last second. Brandon stepped closer to the bed, his expensive designer cologne barely masking the sterile hospital smell. It is nothing major, Dad, he said, his voice maintaining that carefully rehearsed corporate calm. Just a standard medical and financial power of attorney. You know exactly how the board gets when cash flow stalls. I forced my eyes to squint, playing the part of a man whose brain was clouded by morphine and profound fatigue. But 40 years of building a logistics empire from scratch does not just vanish because of a blocked artery. My mind was sharp, evaluating every syllable he spoke. I looked down at the documents. I shifted my gaze from the paperwork back to my stepson. I looked at his hands. For all his smooth talking and tailored suits, Brandon was still an amateur, playing in a high-stakes arena. His left hand resting on the edge of the plastic tray was trembling. I let out a ragged cough, letting my head loll back against the thin hospital pillow. Oh, Brandon, I mumbled, slurring my words slightly to sell the performance. You know I cannot focus on all this dense legal text right now. Just tell me where to sign so you can catch your flight. Cynthia stepped up beside him, her impatience radiating like heat. Just sign it, Richard, she urged, tapping her expensive shoe against the linoleum floor. We really are going to miss the boarding call, and the traffic to the airport is going to be an absolute nightmare today. Her complete disregard for my life was breathtaking. Brandon uncapped his gold fountain pen and pressed it into my weak hand. He pointed to the dotted line at the bottom of the final page. Right here, Dad, he instructed softly, and initial here on the second page. I gripped the cold metal of the pen. My fingers felt stiff, but my mind was operating with crystal clarity. I had signed my name tens of thousands of times over the last 4 decades. Contracts, mergers, acquisitions, and brutal lawsuits. My signature was a brand. I let my hand shake violently as the nib touched the heavy paper. I dragged the pen across the dotted line, crafting a jagged, sloppy scrawl. I intentionally broke the rhythm, omitting the signature loop. I made the letters look exactly like the desperate scribbles of a man whose brain was deprived of oxygen. Brandon snatched the paper the second the pen lifted from the page. "Thank you, Dad," he said, his voice instantly regaining its arrogant, confident edge. "This is going to make everything so much easier for everyone. You just focus on resting and letting the doctors do their jobs." Cynthia leaned down and pressed a dry mechanical kiss to my forehead. "Call us when they move you out of intensive care," she said, already turning toward the door. "We will send you some pictures from the beach. We need to leave before the afternoon rush hour begins, or we will miss our flight entirely." I simply nodded, watching her walk away. Without another word, they turned and walked out of the trauma bay. The door clicked shut behind them, sealing me inside the sterile room. Then the facade dropped. The frail, confused old man vanished into thin air. I sat up straight, ignoring the dull ache radiating through my chest. I reached up and ripped the secondary oxygen monitor off my finger. I pulled the adhesive of the backup heart monitor from my collarbone. My fingers hovered over the glass screen of the tablet. I bypassed the standard biometric security locks and accessed the master portal for our joint banking accounts. The hospital wireless network was slow, agonizingly sluggish, but the spinning loading wheel gave me a few necessary seconds to brace my mind. The main dashboard finally loaded, displaying a cascading list of recent transactions. I tapped directly on the primary credit account, linked specifically to Cynthia. I genuinely expected to see the first-class flight upgrades she had mentioned on the phone. I expected to see the luxury resort reservations that were allegedly non-refundable. Exactly 2 hours after the emergency paramedics had wheeled my lifeless body out of my corporate office, and exactly 2 hours after she received the frantic telephone call from the emergency room. Doctor, telling her I was in critical condition, my loving wife had gone shopping. I stared at the numbers until my vision literally blurred. This was not a relaxing vacation to decompress. This was not a necessary trip to escape the emotional stress of my severe medical emergency. This was a victory lap. They were actively celebrating. I calmly closed the personal checking portal and navigated to the secure corporate ledger for my logistics software company. I desperately needed to see exactly how much structural damage Brandon had caused while masquerading as the chief operating officer of my empire. A massive glaring anomaly sat right there in the pending outbound queue, waiting to be cleared by the bank. It was a prioritized wire transfer for exactly $50,000, pulled directly from our primary corporate operating account. I narrowed my eyes, tapping on the transaction to expand the recipient details. My analytical mind raced rapidly, connecting the dark dots with lethal, unforgiving precision. Brandon was not a visionary entrepreneur. He did not possess the strategic vision, the raw intelligence, or the fundamental grit required to build a successful company from nothing. He only knew how to dismantle and sell what I had already painstakingly created. I needed a verified pair of eyes on the inside immediately. I needed a trusted ally who could navigate the corporate servers and see the hidden shadows Brandon was casting across my own building. I minimized the banking application and opened my encrypted contact list. I took one final deep breath of the sterile hospital air, letting the cold reality of my situation settle deep into my bones. There was no turning back now. The illusion of my happy, loving family had been shattered, permanently replaced by a greedy syndicate of thieves waiting for my heart to stop beating. "Richard," Sarah answered, her voice tight with an anxiety she rarely displayed. "The hospital called the main office. They said you had a massive coronary incident. I was grabbing my coat to drive down there right now. How are you even speaking to me? Should you be on a phone?" "Sarah, listen to me very carefully," I said, keeping my voice low and devoid of the panic she was projecting. "I do not have time for medical updates, and you do not have time to drive to this hospital. I need you sitting exactly where you are, behind your desk, logged into the primary secure terminal." There was a brief, stunned silence on the other end of the line. Sarah Jenkins had been my chief financial officer for nearly 15 years, but her loyalty stretched back much further. "I am at my desk," Sarah confirmed, her professional instincts instantly overriding her personal concern. "Tell me what you need." "Brandon has locked me out of the master executive suite," I explained, staring at the sterile tiles above my hospital bed. "He just visited me here in the intensive care unit and pushed a full medical and financial power of attorney into my hands." I heard Sarah draw in a sharp, ragged breath. Even in the finance department, the name Vanguard and Hayes was universally recognized as the absolute grim reaper of corporate restructuring. "That makes no sense," Sarah whispered, the rapid typing on her keyboard echoing through the phone receiver. "Brandon does not have the unilateral authority to hire external liquidation counsel, and he certainly does not have the operating budget clearance to issue a $50,000 retainer without my direct verified countersignature. He does if he assumes I am going to be dead before tomorrow morning," I replied coldly. "He and his mother are currently sitting in the first-class lounge at the airport waiting to board a flight to Maui. Richard, if I bypass his specific executive firewalls, his monitoring software will flag my terminal," Sarah warned. "He will know someone is digging through his private directories." "Let him know," I stated firmly. "I gave that boy everything he could ever dream of." I handed him a corner office with a panoramic view of the skyline. I gave him a bloated six-figure salary that he never earned. Instead, he just learned how to steal it. "He has always been a parasite, Richard," Sarah said, her voice dropping into a dangerous, protective whisper. We both knew he lacked the grit to actually build anything of value. "Give me 20 minutes. I am going to rip his personal servers wide open." The secure line went silent. I lowered the tablet to my chest and closed my eyes, letting the mechanical hum of the intensive care unit wash over me. My physical heart was severely damaged, heavily bruised and beating with a painful, irregular rhythm, but my mind had never been more focused. The minutes stretched on with agonizing slowness. A young nurse quietly entered the room to check my intravenous fluid lines, casting a suspicious glance at the glowing tablet resting on my lap. Exactly 20 minutes later, my private secure line buzzed. I answered it immediately. "Sarah," I said, "what did you find?" I could hear the trembling in her breath before she even spoke a single word. The steady, reliable chief financial officer, who had fearlessly negotiated multi-million-dollar mergers without breaking a sweat, was currently shaking. "Richard," Sarah began, her voice cracking under the immense weight of her discovery. "Brandon is not just hiring restructuring lawyers to reorganize the vendor payrolls. I finally broke through his encrypted personal folders and found a hidden directory containing months of confidential internal communications." "Tell me exactly what you are looking at," I commanded, my grip tightening around the cold metallic edge of the hospital bed railing. "He has been secretly funneling our proprietary source code, our primary client databases, and our entire 5-year financial projection portfolio to an aggressive venture capital firm based out of New York," Sarah explained, the sound of her frantic scrolling filling the quiet room. "He has deliberately bypassed our internal legal department and engaged Vanguard and Hayes." She paused, letting the devastating reality of the situation settle between us in the cold silence. The oxygen machine hummed loudly beside my bed, a stark reminder of my vulnerability. But the weakness in my physical body was instantly replaced by a burning, unyielding resolve. "Richard," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible over the sterile noise of the busy intensive care unit. "Brandon is not just running payroll. I found the emails. He is selling the entire company." "Selling the company," I repeated, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. My voice was flat. The heart monitor beside my bed maintained its steady rhythmic pulse, betraying none of the absolute fury igniting in my veins. I instructed Sarah to print every single document, every email thread, and every hidden contract she had managed to excavate from his server. I told her to put it all on physical paper. Digital files could be wiped remotely, but physical ink was permanent. Exactly 45 minutes later, the door to my hospital room swung open. Sarah walked in. She was carrying a massive, ostentatious gift basket, wrapped in bright yellow cellophane and stuffed with exotic fruits. To any passing doctor or nurse, She was merely a concerned corporate colleague, delivering a standard get-well-soon present. "The nurses think I am just here to drop this off and say a quick prayer," Sarah whispered, glancing nervously at the small window of my room. "You have about 10 minutes before they come back to check your intravenous lines." Read fast. "Richard, it is worse than we could have ever imagined." I nodded, waiting for her to step back out into the hallway to stand guard. Once the door clicked shut, I pulled the heavy folder from beneath the thin cotton blanket. My fingers were slightly numb from the medication, but my mind operated with lethal precision. I opened the cover. I flipped to the next page, my breathing remaining slow and measured. The mechanics of his betrayal were laid out in stark black and white ink. Brandon had quietly negotiated this entire deal over the past 4 months. I continued to turn the pages, the cold reality of my situation settling deeply into my chest. The financial documents were infuriating, but they were simply business. The final document, in the folder, however, was something different. It was a printed copy of a forwarded email. He wrote, "The lawyers are ready for Monday. Once the old man croaks, the holding company automatically defaults to Mom. We take our 30% cash out, let the venture guys strip the remaining assets, and he dies a forgotten footnote. Start looking at those properties in the Hamptons. We are finally free. He dies a forgotten footnote." I read that single sentence 3 times. For 15 years I provided this boy with a life of absolute privilege. I paid for his education, handed him a career, and treated him with respect. And in return, he viewed my impending death as a convenient financial transaction. I closed the folder and rested my hands on top of it. A normal man might have broken down. A normal man might have wept at the sheer cruelty of his own family. A normal man might have pressed the call button, begging for sedatives to dull the emotional pain. But I did not cry. I slipped the folder back under my blanket just as the door swung open. Sarah stepped back inside, followed closely by a young nurse checking her clipboard. I let my smile fade, replacing it instantly with the mask of a tired, broken old man. Sarah rushed to my bedside, her eyes wide with concern and fear. "Richard," she whispered urgently, "what are we going to do?" "He is going to sign those final papers on Monday morning. If that venture capital firm gets their hands on our source code, we are finished." I looked at my brilliant chief financial officer. My voice was steady, dropping into a tone she had not heard from me since our most brutal corporate battles a decade ago. "Sarah, my friend," I said calmly, "call Harrison Cole, tell him to use the freight elevator and bypass the front desk. I want him sitting in this room in exactly 1 hour. We have a company to save and a family to destroy." The door to my hospital room remained closed. I lay still against the stiff mattress, watching the second hands sweep across the large wall clock. Exactly 58 minutes had passed since my conversation with Sarah. The intensive care unit was deceptively quiet, a stark contrast to the absolute warfare currently brewing inside my mind. He brushed a speck of invisible dust from the lapel of his suit and locked the door behind him. Harrison was 50 years old, sharp as a scalpel, and utterly devoid of professional mercy. He was my personal wealth attorney, a man who charged $2,000 an hour to make rich men impenetrable. Harrison approached the foot of my bed, his eyes scanning the medical monitors before finally resting on my face. "You look remarkably alert for a man who officially died for 90 seconds yesterday morning," he stated, his voice a low, gravely baritone that commanded instant authority. I let out a dry, humorless breath. "Death is surprisingly motivating, Harrison." I reached beneath my thin hospital blanket and pulled out the thick manila folder Sarah had smuggled inside the fruit basket. I tossed it onto the plastic tray table. "I need you to read this immediately," I commanded. "Every single page." Harrison did not ask any useless questions. He pulled a pair of reading glasses from his breast pocket, dragged a plastic visitor chair to the side of my bed, and opened the folder. I watched his face closely as he reviewed the digital blood trail. Harrison closed the thick folder and slowly took off his glasses, folding the arms with a sharp metallic click. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the rhythmic beeping of my heart monitor. "I have dealt with some truly despicable human beings in my career, Richard," Harrison said, his voice laced with a cold, professional disgust. I have seen brothers steal from brothers and children bankrupt their own parents. They are actively looting your personal estate before your body has even had a chance to grow cold. Brandon also paid me a visit before his flight to Hawaii, I explained quietly. He brought a full medical and financial power of attorney. He needs that specific document to legally bypass the mandatory shareholder approval and finalize the software company sale on Monday morning. Harrison leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. Tell me you did not sign that document, Richard. Tell me you did not hand that boy the loaded gun. I raised my hand to stop his rising panic. I signed it, I repeated smoothly, but I did not use my actual signature. I handed him an invalid piece of paper, and he was so terrified and eager to steal my empire that he snatched it away without even verifying the ink. You gave him a defective grenade, he murmured. The moment Vanguard and Hayes attempt to submit that power of attorney to the bank or the venture capital firm, their own compliance officers will flag the signature discrepancy. We can stop the corporate sale on Monday morning and immediately strip Brandon of his chief operating officer title. I shook my head, gripping the edge of the blanket tightly. You are not listening to me, Harrison. I do not want to play defense. Stopping the sale is merely a temporary bandage. If we just invalidate the document and fire him, he will spin a lie. I want the credit cards severed. Harrison narrowed his eyes, analyzing the full scope of the requested destruction. If we pull this trigger, Richard, Cynthia will be left with nothing. Are you prepared for that? I looked at my attorney, my heart beating with cold absolute certainty. Make it -0. Harrison stared at me for a long moment, the heavy silence of the intensive care unit amplifying the staggering weight of my demand. He did not argue or attempt to temper my absolute fury. He simply nodded slowly, his expression hardening into a chilling mask of pure professional ruthlessness. I will have the comprehensive trust framework drafted and ready for your execution signature by midnight, he said, his voice dropping into a barely audible whisper. But we cannot conduct a sensitive financial operation of this massive magnitude from a heavily monitored hospital bed. I told him I would personally handle my own medical excursions and explicitly instructed him to meet me at a confidential secondary location. After he quietly slipped back out through the door, deliberately returning to the unmonitored basement utility corridors, I pressed the plastic nurse call button. It took 20 grueling minutes of aggressive negotiation, 3 forcefully signed legal waivers, releasing the entire medical facility from any and all potential liability, and an explicit, unyielding threat to personally purchase the entire cardiac hospital wing, just to fire the attending physician, to finally process a formal against medical advice discharge. At exactly 2 in the morning, the sprawling hospital corridors were dimly lit and hauntingly quiet. The exhausted night shift staff moved sluggishly behind their illuminated counters, paying no attention to the supposedly dying old man, dressed in loose civilian clothes, who was walking slowly and deliberately toward the rear service exit. Sarah was already waiting patiently in the dark loading dock alleyway. Sitting inside a discreet, heavily tinted black sedan, the powerful engine was idling silently in the freezing, bitter Chicago air. I carefully climbed into the leather passenger seat, tightly gripping the plastic dashboard with trembling fingers, until my erratic breathing finally stabilized. We drove in complete silence through the deserted city streets, navigating toward a private, unlisted loft apartment I secretly owned deep within the industrial district. Harrison's was already waiting impatiently in his expansive loft when we finally arrived. His leather briefcase was opened wide on a large oak dining table, surrounded by thick stacks of freshly printed, legally binding documents. For the next 24 exhausting hours, we did not sleep. First, we attacked the core corporate structure, utilizing my legitimate, legally verified digital executive signature. I unilaterally and permanently terminated Brandon's official status as the chief operating officer of my company, permanently stripping his administrative network access and legally nullifying his ability to authorize any future business transactions. Next, we pursued the personal wealth portfolios I had accumulated. I systematically liquidated the conservative mutual funds, the lucrative offshore investment accounts, and the massive high-yield dividend portfolios I had carefully curated over 4 decades of tireless labor. The final devastating step of our relentless operation was arguably the most deeply personal. I slowly logged into the primary joint checking account, the limitless overflowing fountain of personal wealth that Cynthia had been brazenly using to generously fund her lavish celebratory Maui vacation. I calmly closed the heavy laptop screen, the sharp, satisfying metallic click echoing loudly through the otherwise silent loft apartment. My damaged chest ached profoundly. My eyes were heavy with a deeply profound exhaustion, but a vast, satisfying peace finally settled over my weary soul. The intricate financial execution was utterly flawless. The morning sun slowly began to filter through the heavy industrial blinds of my safe house, casting long geometric shadows across the oak dining table. Harrison had departed hours ago, leaving me alone with my thoughts, my cold coffee, and an untraceable burner phone resting on the polished wood. I did not have to wait long for the fallout to reach me. At exactly 8:15, the burner phone vibrated, shattering the heavy silence of the loft. It was an automated notification from my secure corporate server, alerting me that an emergency voicemail had been deposited into my heavily encrypted private inbox. The audio began with a cacophony of vibrant background noise. I could hear the gentle crash of ocean waves, the soft rhythmic strumming of a live acoustic guitar, and the distinct, unmistakable clinking of fine crystal. "Listen to me very carefully," Cynthia hissed into the phone. Her words were slightly slurred from what I easily deduced was an excessive amount of expensive alcohol. "I am Cynthia Vales. I need a senior account manager on the line right this second." In the background of the recording, I could clearly hear Brandon laughing. An arrogant, relaxed sound that made my chest ache with fresh anger. I heard him casually tell a waiter to bring another bottle of their finest vintage champagne, a vintage I knew for a fact cost upwards of $500 a bottle. "I am waiting," Cynthia snapped at the automated banking prompt, her patience rapidly disintegrating. My black card was just declined by a 20-year-old waiter. "Do you have any idea how humiliating that is? I have an absolute zero limit on this account. You need to remove the travel block immediately." "Yes, I am speaking with the bank right now," she said, clearly addressing the unseen hotel staff member. "It is simply a routine security measure because we flew in from Chicago yesterday. Just run these alternative cards while I sort out the primary line." I closed my eyes and visualized the exact scene unfolding thousands of miles away. Cynthia, draped in silk, trying to maintain her flawless, wealthy facade while handing over a stack of useless plastic. I heard a chair scrape loudly against the wooden deck. "What do you mean they are all declining?" Brandon demanded, his voice suddenly cutting through the ambient noise. His relaxed, victorious demeanor had vanished instantly. "That is impossible. Try running them again. Run them manually." The waiter, maintaining a rigid professional courtesy, responded quietly. "I apologize, sir, but the terminal is explicitly instructing us to confiscate the cards. The hotel manager is currently verifying the status of your penthouse suite reservation, as the original card on file is also reflecting a frozen status." The sheer panic that erupted from my wife was music to my weary ears. A penthouse suite at the Four Seasons, a private yacht charter, and an unlimited tab of premium champagne, all suddenly unsupported by the massive fortune they thought they had successfully stolen. "Brandon, give him your corporate card," Cynthia demanded, her voice climbing into an octave of pure hysteria. "Just put the dinner in the room on the company account until I can get my useless wealth manager on the phone tomorrow morning." I heard the sound of a heavy leather wallet being slapped onto the table. "Just run this one," Brandon ordered the waiter, his tone thick with a forced, desperate bravado. "It is a premium corporate executive account. There are no spending limits. Go do it now." I leaned back in my chair, a cold smile touching the corners of my mouth. I had specifically instructed Harrison to liquidate and sever the corporate cards first. I knew Brandon would immediately attempt to lean on the company infrastructure the second his personal finances encountered resistance. "What is going on with the bank?" Tiffany, Brandon's wife, finally spoke up, her voice trembling with confusion. "Why are they taking our cards?" "Shut up, Tiffany," Brandon snapped viciously. The old man probably forgot to authorize the travel alert before he went into the hospital. It is just a minor clerical error. It will be fixed by tomorrow. The footsteps returned. The waiter cleared his throat, but this time he was not alone. The deep, authoritative voice of the hotel's night manager echoed clearly through the recording. "Mr. Vales," the manager stated firmly, stripping away the deferential tone they usually reserved for actual paying guests. "We have attempted to authorize the corporate account you provided." I listened to the absolute silence that followed the manager's declaration. It was the sound of a stolen empire collapsing into dust. But what the manager said next was the true final strike. "Therefore, we must insist on a valid alternative form of payment for the dinner you have consumed this evening." The manager continued, his voice devoid of any sympathy. "And regrettably, we must ask you to vacate the penthouse suite immediately, as we cannot allow you to return the room without a verified deposit." The recording abruptly ended, replaced by the digital beep of the server. I stared at the phone. They had planned to leave me as a forgotten footnote, but I had just stranded them in paradise with nothing. I sat in the deep leather armchair of my secure penthouse loft, staring at the dark surface of the oak dining table. Outside the expansive windows, the Chicago skyline glittered with cold, indifferent light, a stark contrast to the tropical warmth I had abruptly stripped away from my treacherous wife and stepson. The physical pain in my chest, a lingering reminder of the massive coronary incident I had survived just days prior, seemed to dull significantly. The sharp thrill of absolute control acted as the perfect anesthetic. I took a slow, deep breath, letting the cool, filtered air fill my healing lungs. The small screen of the phone suddenly illuminated the dark room, casting a pale glow across my hands. It vibrated once, a short, sharp buzz against the table. Then it vibrated again and again. The barrage had officially commenced. I simply sat back and watched the incoming notifications multiply with rapid, frantic precision. The sheer volume of incoming calls painted a vivid picture of their escalating panic. By the time the screen finally stopped flashing, the red text indicated exactly 30 missed calls within 14 minutes. They were trapped thousands of miles from home without a single dollar. Cynthia spoke first, her tone dripping with familiar, grating arrogance. "Richard," her voice barked through the small speaker, sharp and annoyed. "I do not know what kind of incompetent clerical mistake your accounting department has made, but every single one of my cards has been declined. Fix this embarrassing mess right now and tell them to process the charges." The message ended with an aggressive, frustrated sigh. She still believed this was nothing more than a minor administrative glitch. She still genuinely thought she was in control. I smirked in the darkness, swiping my finger across the screen to initiate the second audio file. The second voicemail was left just 3 minutes after the first, but the subtle shift in Cynthia's voice was instantly detectable. The abrasive entitlement was beginning to fracture slowly, giving way to genuine creeping anxiety. "Richard, why are you not answering the emergency proxy line?" she demanded, her breathing noticeably shallow and rapid. "The bank is ignoring my security verification codes. They are refusing to speak with me. We cannot even access the room to retrieve our luggage." The recording clicked off instantly, replaced by the third message. This time it was Brandon. His usual slick, confident corporate persona had vanished, replaced by the frantic, terrified cadence of a cornered animal. "Dad," he began, his voice shaking with pathetic, desperate urgency. "Dad, I know you are probably resting, but we have a massive crisis here. The resort security staff is physically escorting us out of the lobby. They are threatening to file formal criminal charges for defrauding a hospitality establishment. Just pick up the damn phone, please." I listened to his pathetic pleading, feeling no sympathy. He had stood beside my hospital bed, staring at my vulnerable body, and callously orchestrated the complete liquidation of my life's work. He deserved every ounce of the terror he was currently experiencing. I placed the phone back down on the heavy oak table. The room was silent once again. The time for listening was officially over. It was time to deliver the final definitive strike. I picked up the device, opened the encrypted messaging application, and selected a secure line to Brandon's personal cellular device. Your vacation just got extended, by the way. Brandon's power of attorney is void. Have a nice life. I stared at the short, devastating text message, feeling the immense weight of the 15 years I had foolishly wasted on a family that only ever valued my bank accounts. They had asked me to disappear from their lives, and I was simply granting their selfish request with absolute ruthless perfection. I did not hesitate. The loft was silent when the sun crested the Chicago skyline on Monday morning. I sat in the leather armchair, nursing a cup of black coffee, feeling the satisfaction of an executed strategy. At exactly 9 in the morning, Eastern Standard Time, my encrypted email client chimed softly. A single message had arrived from Sarah Jenkins. The subject line simply read, New York correspondence. Attached to the email was a compressed audio file. The recording began with the sharp, hollow ringing of a direct corporate line. When Sterling answered, his voice was crisp, professional, and devoid of warmth. Brandon launched into his pitch immediately, not even bothering with customary pleasantries. His words were rushed, his breathing heavy and erratic. Sterling, he began, his voice laced with a pathetic manufactured confidence. We have a slight operational delay on our end regarding the final acquisition paperwork. I will personally guarantee the funds against my future equity share once the ink is dry. I took a slow sip of my coffee, savoring the absolute absurdity of his request. He was begging a ruthless Wall Street shark for a personal bailout using stolen corporate equity as collateral. Brandon, Sterling said carefully, articulating every single syllable. I am going to stop you right there before you incriminate yourself any further on a recorded line. I do not know what kind of amateur theatrical performance you think you are running. But we are a Tier 1 financial institution, not a payday lending service for stranded tourists. I could hear Brandon stutter, caught off guard by the aggressive shift in tone. Sterling, I do not understand, he stammered, the manufactured confidence instantly evaporating. I have the signed medical and financial power of attorney. I have the legal right to liquidate the holding company. We agreed on the 30% acquisition. We shook hands on this. You do not have anything, Brandon. Sterling interrupted, his voice dropping into a harsh, unforgiving register. Your chief financial officer, Sarah Jenkins, sent my legal department a massive package at 6 this morning. It is utterly worthless. Brandon let out a strangled gasp. The sound of a man watching his only remaining parachute burst into flames. But the holding company, he pleaded, his voice breaking into a high, panicked whine. When he dies, my mother gets the holding company. We can just restructure the deal through her. I need that cash right now. Sterling let out a dry, humorless chuckle. You really have no idea what is happening, do you? Sterling asked, his tone shifting from anger to pure, unadulterated pity. There is no holding company anymore, Brandon. There is nothing left for your mother to inherit, even if he were to pass away this morning. The silence that followed was absolute. I could almost hear the tropical wind blowing through the speaker, carrying the shattered remains of Brandon's ego out to sea. But Sterling was not quite finished. He possessed the vicious instincts of a true corporate predator, and he was determined to leave no room for misunderstanding. Furthermore, Sterling continued, his voice sharp as a razor blade, I received a formal notice of termination alongside the legal injunction. You do not own 30% of that software empire, Brandon. If you call this number one more time, I will personally forward this entire recording to the federal authorities. The line went dead with a sharp, decisive click. The audio file ended, leaving me sitting in the peaceful quiet of my secure loft. I slowly closed the laptop, letting my hands rest on the warm aluminum casing. The trap had not just snapped shut, it had obliterated the predators. I stood up and walked over to the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking down at the bustling streets of Chicago. The city was moving. People were going to work, unaware of the silent, brutal war that had just been decisively won in the shadows. I thought about Cynthia, Brandon, and Tiffany currently standing in the humid Hawaiian morning air. I smiled gently at the glass pane, wondering exactly how a family so accustomed to private jets and high-class treatment would manage to secure 3 economy tickets back to reality. The answer to my quiet question involved a level of profound degradation that Cynthia and her spoiled son had never experienced in their entire privileged lives. with their designer luggage locked inside the hotel storage room, pending a final payment they could not produce. They were unceremoniously escorted off the resort property. They found themselves standing under the brutal Hawaiian sun, wearing the same lightweight resort clothing they had worn to dinner, devoid of their usual arrogant armor. It was Tiffany who ultimately provided their desperate salvation, though she fought it with every ounce of her superficial being. On her left wrist sat a solid gold Rolex, a lavish anniversary gift I had funded just 2 years ago. They used the cash to immediately purchase 3 standard one-way economy tickets on the first available commercial flight back to Chicago. For my wife, a woman who considered flying commercial to be an unacceptable insult, the journey was a psychological nightmare. During the long flight, Brandon desperately tried to formulate a counterattack. He whispered fiercely to Tiffany, spinning wild, impossible scenarios where he would hire a ruthless team of aggressive litigators to sue me for breach of contract and severe emotional distress. By the time the massive airplane finally touched down at the international airport, they were physically exhausted, emotionally drained, and shivering uncontrollably. They had foolishly departed tropical paradise, wearing thin linen shirts and delicate silk dresses, leaving them unprepared for the biting, unforgiving winter wind howling violently across the freezing cold Midwestern tarmac. They huddled together in the back seat of a worn, heavily used sedan, enduring a tense silence as the driver navigated the busy highway leading toward the affluent northern suburbs. Cynthia stared blankly out the smudged passenger window, her clenched jaw set in a rigid, terrifying line of pure, unadulterated, blinding fury. The vehicle finally turned into their exclusive gated neighborhood, rolling slowly past manicured lawns and towering pristine mansions. Brandon sat up straighter, adjusting the collar of his wrinkled linen shirt. The sight of his massive $5 million property seemed to inject a fresh surge of false confidence into his veins. The car stopped at the end of the long, circular driveway. Brandon practically leaped from the vehicle, marching up the wide stone steps toward the doors, with his head held high. Cynthia and Tiffany followed closely behind him, shivering violently in the freezing evening air, eager to step inside the warm, luxurious foyer. Brandon confidently pulled his heavy metal key from his pocket and jammed it into the brass lock. He turned his wrist sharply, fully expecting the familiar, satisfying click of the deadbolt. The key refused to turn. He frowned, jiggling the metal violently, convinced that the weather had temporarily jammed the delicate internal mechanism. He tried again, pressing harder, his heart rate spiking as the red light illuminated his panicked face for a second time. Access permanently denied, Cynthia pushed past him furiously, demanding that he enter the manual override code. Brandon quickly typed the numbers with trembling fingers. The system beeped twice, a harsh, unforgiving sound that echoed loudly in the quiet suburban night. The doors remained sealed. The sprawling $5 million mansion they considered their absolute property was locked down. As the horrifying reality of their total exclusion began to settle heavily over them, the motion sensor lights on the expansive wraparound porch suddenly flared to life. The brilliant illumination cast long, stark shadows across the manicured landscaping. Harrison did not move a single muscle as Brandon stared at him in absolute shock. The night air whipped across the stone porch, freezing the arrogant breath right inside my stepson. Behind Harrison, stepping smoothly out from the heavy shadows of the manicured security hedges, were 2 massive men dressed in identical dark suits. Cynthia was the first to finally break the silence. She wrapped her thin silk shawl tightly around her shaking shoulders and demanded to know what my attorney was doing on her property in the middle of the night. Harrison simply smiled, a thin, humorless expression that did nothing to warm his face. He calmly reached inside the inner pocket of his heavy wool overcoat and slowly extracted a thick manila envelope. He held it out toward her, his hands steady in the bitter cold. "This property no longer belongs to you, Cynthia," Harrison stated, his voice carrying easily over the howling wind. "In fact, as of Friday evening, the title was permanently transferred into a blind corporate trust, an entity over which you possess no legal authority or marital claim." He stepped down one stone stair and pressed the heavy envelope directly against her shivering chest, until she was forced to instinctively grab it. These are your formal divorce papers, properly filed, fully expedited, and legally binding. Cynthia stared down at the thick stack of premium legal paper, her manicured fingers trembling violently. She tried to muster a laugh, a pathetic, high-pitched sound of pure denial. Harrison buttoned his overcoat against the wind and shook his head with profound professional pity. He calmly reminded her of the ironclad prenuptial agreement she had eagerly signed 15 years ago. He recited the specific penalty clauses from memory, detailing the severe consequences of financial infidelity. You legally forfeit all spousal support, Cynthia, Harrison concluded, his tone merciless. You are entitled to 0 alimony, 0 property division, and 0 compensation. You leave this marriage with exactly the clothes currently on your back. Harrison adjusted his pristine collar, ensuring his posture remained impeccably upright. He displayed no emotion as he silently judged the pathetic woman, who had arrogantly attempted to discard a dying man for a lavish tropical vacation. Brandon violently shoved his mother behind him, his face turning a vibrant, dangerous shade of crimson. He began to scream into the freezing night, his voice echoing loudly against the neighboring stone mansions. He demanded to be led inside the house, furiously claiming that he was a victim of an illegal corporate coup. Harrison did not flinch, nor did he raise his voice to match Brandon. He simply reached back into his heavy overcoat and pulled out a second, slightly thinner, envelope. He extended his arm, waiting patiently, until Brandon finally stopped screaming and snatched the paper from his hand. You are officially terminated for gross corporate espionage, systemic fraud, and attempted grand larceny, Harrison explained smoothly. Your executive privileges were permanently revoked 48 hours ago. Brandon ripped the envelope open, his eyes frantically scanning the formal termination letter. He stammered that a termination required board approval, that a dying man could not unilaterally execute a firing of a senior partner. Harrison took a slow, deliberate step forward, closing the distance between them. Richard is very much alive, Brandon, he stated softly. And he is very, very angry. They currently possess the Vanguard and Hayes email threads, the financial wire receipts, and the blatantly forged medical power of attorney you foolishly tried to execute. Tiffany collapsed onto the cold driveway, burying her face in her hands and sobbing uncontrollably. The devastating reality of their situation was finally crashing down around them with the heavy, inescapable weight of a collapsing building. They were locked out of their magnificent mansion. Their endless bank accounts were drained. I strongly suggest you vacate this private property immediately, Harrison commanded, gesturing slightly toward the 2 massive security contractors waiting silently on the porch. If you remain on this driveway for another 60 seconds, these gentlemen are under strict, uncompromising orders to physically detain you and summon the local authorities for criminal trespassing. Cynthia tried to speak, her mouth opening and closing like a suffocated fish, but no words came out. Brandon dropped the termination letter onto the frozen concrete, his shoulders slumping in total absolute defeat. Cynthia, a woman whose entire existence was meticulously built upon a foundation of absolute unyielding arrogance, was now shattered. Her curated facade simply dissolved into the wind. Her knees buckled beneath her thin, expensive dress, and she collapsed violently onto the hard, frozen driveway. She began to beg me. It was a pathetic, breathless stream of absolute desperation pouring from her trembling lips. She pleaded with my attorney to immediately stop this madness, claiming that this entire ordeal was nothing more than a catastrophic, horrible misunderstanding that could be resolved very quickly. Harrison did not take a single step backward, nor did he attempt to pull his expensive coat away from her desperate clawing grip as she wept on the ground. He simply stood there, an immovable monument of professional apathy, staring down at her with a look of clinical detachment. Behind her, Brandon remained frozen in his rigid place. The once arrogant, high-powered corporate executive was now nothing more than a terrified, shivering boy standing in the wind. He offered his weeping mother no physical assistance whatsoever. He did not reach down to help her stand up. I watched this entire pathetic spectacle unfold from the absolute comfort of my secure, luxurious penthouse loft miles away in the city. The glowing screen of my heavily laptop displayed a crystal-clear, high-resolution feed from the advanced security cameras I had personally installed around the suburban perimeter. The cameras captured every single agonizing detail of their humiliation. I sat deeply in my plush leather armchair, wrapped in a thick, warm blanket, holding a steaming ceramic mug of bitter black coffee. I took a slow, deliberate sip, letting the rich, dark liquid thoroughly warm my dry throat. I felt no pity for their sudden, devastating downfall. I felt no regret for the actions I took. I placed the warm coffee mug down onto the surface of the oak dining table and leaned forward slightly, resting my heavy elbows lightly on my freshly healed knees. I slowly reached out and pressed my index finger against the digital intercom button on the security application interface. I leaned much closer to the sensitive laptop microphone, keeping my voice calm, remarkably steady, and devoid of any trace of emotional warmth or lingering sentimental family attachment. "You did not want to miss your flight to Hawaii, Cynthia." My voice boomed deeply through the high-fidelity outdoor speakers, echoing loudly across the massive stone veranda and rolling heavily down the long circular driveway into the winter night. "You packed your bags while my heart monitor was still frantically beeping." The psychological impact of my voice was, and profoundly devastating. Cynthia let out a loud, piercing wail, covering her ears as if my spoken words were physically burning her skin. Brandon collapsed against the cold stone wall, sliding down slowly until he was sitting helplessly on the frozen ground, right next to his softly weeping wife. I removed my finger from the digital intercom button, instantly severing the audio connection and plunging the estate back into the cold, unforgiving silence of the bitter winter. On the screen, I watched as Harrison Cole gave a single, almost imperceptible nod to the two massive private security contractors standing silently in the shadows of the porch. Exactly 30 days. After that freezing night on the driveway, I walked through the towering doors of my corporate headquarters. The morning sun illuminated the expansive marble lobby, reflecting brightly off the polished surfaces and casting a glow over the bustling space. My physical recovery had been nothing short of miraculous. The dedicated security personnel and administrative staff smiled warmly as I passed, their eyes reflecting genuine relief and profound respect. They had all witnessed the chaotic, sudden departure of my treacherous stepson, and they knew the rightful architect of the company had fully returned to his throne. I reached over to the secure phone console and pressed the intercom button. I asked my executive assistant to locate Sarah Jenkins and send her to my office immediately. Less than 5 minutes later, the door swung open. Sarah stepped inside, carrying her usual stack of financial ledgers and analytical reports. "I did not call you up here to discuss the quarterly margins, Sarah," I stated calmly, my voice carrying a deep, resonant warmth. "I called you here to discuss the permanent future of this company." I leaned forward, folding my hands together on the desk. Sarah lowered her eyes, a rare display of quiet emotion washing over her face. "It was the only acceptable course of action, Richard," she replied softly. "I could never let them destroy what you created." "I know," I said, "and that is exactly why I am officially terminating your current position as Chief Financial Officer." I slid a heavy embossed leather folder across the desk. "Effective immediately, you are the new Chief Operating Officer of this corporation. You have full executive authority, complete board voting rights, and a significantly expanded equity stake." Sarah stared at the leather folder, stunned by the magnitude of the promotion. It was a position she had rightfully earned a dozen times over, a position Brandon had shamelessly occupied through nepotism alone. She slowly opened the cover, reading the formal executive decree. "We have a massive amount of work to do, Sarah," I continued, my tone shifting back into a focused, commanding rhythm. "We are going to expand our logistics network, and I need a truly lethal operational commander to lead the charge. Are you ready to go to war?" Sarah closed the folder, sitting up straight, her eyes locked onto mine, burning with fierce, unstoppable determination. "I am ready," she declared, her voice steady and powerful. We spent the next 3 hours mapping out a comprehensive, aggressive corporate strategy, reshaping the company hierarchy, and permanently purging every single useless executive Brandon had foolishly hired during his arrogant tenure. Once she finally departed my office to execute our new directives, I requested another essential meeting. Harrison Cole arrived shortly after lunch, carrying his signature leather briefcase and wearing his usual expression of cold professional detachment. We had a different kind of restructuring to finalize. I refused to leave a single dollar to pure unadulterated greed, I explained to my attorney as he quickly drafted the new legal parameters. As the late afternoon sun began to dip below the towering city skyscrapers, casting long, dramatic shadows across my office, my private cellular phone vibrated softly on the desk. It was the encrypted message from Robert Sanchez, the elite private investigator I had retained to quietly monitor the ensuing fallout. The sheer magnitude of their profound misery was meticulously documented in stark, undeniable facts. Brandon was currently sitting in a small, windowless interrogation room at the federal courthouse. The district attorney had formally indicted him on multiple severe counts of aggressive wire fraud, grand larceny, and corporate espionage. The second half of the detailed investigative report focused on Cynthia, the woman who had callously demanded I disappear from her life. The woman who had spent decades arrogantly parading through elite country clubs and exclusive designer boutiques was now and utterly destitute. I closed the investigative report and carefully set the phone down on the smooth mahogany wood. I pictured Cynthia deeply exhausted, her feet throbbing in cheap shoes, desperately trying to maintain a shred of her former dignity while bagging clearance items under the harsh buzzing fluorescent lights. I walked over to the massive window, looking down at the vibrant, glowing city below. My heart beat with a steady, powerful, and peaceful rhythm. The sprawling empire was safe, my legacy was permanently secured, and absolute, uncompromising justice had been served cold.